Okay, so we talked last week about the Constitutional Convention. So now we're going to talk about ratification and the process of putting this new Constitution into effect. So, in order for the Constitution to go into effect, 9 of 13 states had to ratify it, meaning 9 of 13 states had to vote in favor of it. So, ratification is going to become the subject of debate, especially in newspapers. They don't have TVs at the time, so the debate's going to take place in newspapers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. It becomes the first real political campaign between those that are in favor of this new Constitution and the system of government that it creates and those that are opposed to it. So supporters of the Constitution and a strong federal government are called Federalists. Those that argue against the new Constitution and are more in favor of strong state governments and states retaining their sovereignty are called Anti-Federalists. So some of the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists are going to point out the problems with the Articles of Confederation. And we talked a little bit last week about some of those weaknesses and limitations of the Articles. So for example, the federal government did not have the power to tax, so they weren't able to pay their debts. And even though the federal government had the power to build an army, they weren't able to maintain an army or raise an army because they didn't have any money to do so. Okay, so these are some of the problems with the Articles. So the Federalists are going to warn that the only way to avoid those problems was with this new Constitution, this new system of government that is going to address and provide solutions to those weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And the Federalists are going to include elites like George Washington, I'm not sure what happened to the ton here, and Benjamin Franklin. Now, the Anti-Federalists, there's a little bit of negativity associated with that name. So that anti, okay, is going to associate some negativity there. They're going to raise fears about what a new government would bring. Okay, so they're going to say, hey, we just signed the Declaration of Independence. We just won the Revolutionary War. We've separated from Great Britain. We didn't want that type of government anymore. We didn't want to have a monarch. We don't want another chance for tyranny to take place. So they're really going to be concerned with that single executive, so that president position that's included in the new Constitution. They're going to argue that the government would trample on the rights of people and the states. So again, Anti-Federalists are wanting states to maintain more power, more sovereignty. So let's look at some of the differences again between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. So Federalists are going to favor the Constitution. Anti-Federalists are going to oppose it. Again, the Federalists are going to stress the weaknesses of the Articles and say that a strong government is going to be needed to address those weaknesses, whereas Anti-Federalists are going to want strong state governments. Federalists will argue that checks and balances, so remember we talked about how the different branches of government are able to check each other, are going to protect against those government abuses, whereas Anti-Federalists are going to say that a strong executive is going to be really similar to a monarch or a king. And one thing to point out down here is a Bill of Rights. So that's going to be a big source of debate, is whether or not a Bill of Rights, so a list of citizens' protections from the government, should they be included in the Constitution? The Federalists are going to say no. They're going to say that by including a specific list, that the rights of citizens could potentially be limited to just those that are on that list, okay? Whereas Anti-Federalists are going to say, hey, we need a Bill of Rights in our Constitution to protect citizens from the government. So again, big source of debate. So some of the main issues that are going to be part of this ratification debate and process. One, the feasibility of a Republican government in such a large nation. Okay, so remember, a Republican government means that the people hold the power and that they're going to vote and elect their officials. So is this going to work in such a large nation? The second thing is going to be the relative power of the states and the national government. So what are the power of the states? What are the powers of the national government? And then the third thing is, again, that lack of Bill of Rights. So should a Bill of Rights be included in the Constitution? So the Federalist Papers, and again, remember, newspapers are going to be a big source of this debate and the ratification process. So Federalists are going to have to explain to Americans that a large republic could be constructed in a way that would prevent it from growing to the point that it would trample on the rights of states and citizens. So anti-Federalists have raised these fears, and Federalists are going to take to the newspapers to say, hey, this is why a new constitution is needed. This is why it's going to work, and you shouldn't worry about this. They're going to make their case in the Federalist Papers that are published in newspapers from fall of 1787 to 1788 under the collective name Publius. So the Federalist Papers are going to be a series of essays, actually 85 essays, that are written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they are intended to influence this ratification debate. Again, they're addressing the concerns of the anti-federalists with their arguments in favor of the Constitution. And they're especially trying to influence the ratification debate in New York, because that's going to be a heavily contested state. So Madison's essays are going to tackle anti-federalist critiques by laying out the reasons behind the proposed constitutional republic. So he's going to try to alleviate their fears by saying, this is why this constitution, why this system of government is needed. So one of the specific Federalist papers that you need to know for the AP exam is Federalist 10. And we're going to do some analysis of it in class, but just so you know the main arguments of it. We'll talk about it here too. So there is this fear among the states, the people in the states, that people acting according to their own self-interest could be a danger to the republic. So Madison is going to call a faction, and this is in Federalist 10 where he points this out, a group of self-interested individuals who use the government to get what they want, trampling on the rights of others. So a faction could be considered an interest group, so a group of people that are trying to use the government to benefit themselves. And Madison is going to argue that factions could be the most dangerous challenge to the republic. So he says that interest groups in government, whether a majority or minority, united by some common impulse of passion or interest adverse to the rights of other citizens. Okay, so that's what he's saying about factions. That's what they are. And they are going to try to do things with the government to benefit themselves. He's saying that factions are very dangerous. But in Federalist 10, he's also going to argue that the dangers of faction can be mitigated by a large republic and a republican government. Okay, so this large republic where there's many people, the people are supposed to hold the power, and the representatives are going to be elected, it is going to mitigate those dangers of a faction. He says that the best way to check the power of factions is through a republic that is so large and so diverse with so many factions or interest groups vying for power that no one faction is going to be able to assert its will over others. So factions that arrive from New England and from Georgia, it doesn't matter. They would neutralize each other. Okay, so there's so many different interests and so many different factions that are going to be trying to vie for power that no one faction is going to be able to hold all of the power, is what he is arguing here. So Madison is going to counter the anti-federalist argument that the republic would be too large to govern effectively by explaining the need for a large republic. So he is saying here, yes, the Constitution is going to work. This Republican government is going to work, and this is why. And that's where we're going to stop.